The hidden underground passage that Jackson Mercer uncovered beneath his family's collapsing barn floor wouldn't just transform his understanding of his struggling Vermont homestead, it would reveal an underground railroad secret so extraordinary that it would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about America's most courageous resistance network. What this third-generation farmer discovered beneath decades of soil and forgotten timbers would spark an international academic controversy, ignite a race for preservation, and ultimately change not just his family's fortune, but our collective understanding of how ordinary citizens risked everything to defy unjust laws and save lives during our nation's darkest chapter. The morning mist clung to the rolling Vermont hills, shrouding Oakridge Farm in a dreamlike haze as Jack Mercer's pickup truck rumbled along the muddy access road, cutting through his family's maple groves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 54, Jack carried the weathered look of a man who had spent his life working outdoors, his face lined from decades of harsh winters and summer sun, hands calloused from work that seemed to multiply faster than it could be completed. The truck's headlights cut through the lingering morning fog, illuminating the familiar landscape of Oakridge Farm, 175 acres that had once been among the most productive dairy and maple operations in Riverdale County, but now struggled to remain viable. In an era of industrial agriculture and changing consumer demands, the devastating spring floods that had ravaged the region had finally receded, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water and mud. Jack had spent anxious nights in his farmhouse with his border collie Scout, listening to the relentless rain hammer against the roof and wondering what damage assessment dawn would bring. The farm had weathered countless Vermont seasons, over 3 generations of Mercer stewardship, but rarely one with such persistent fury as this spring had delivered. Jack had been renovating the old stone and timber barn, built by his great-great-grandfather, Elijah, in 1842, into a rustic event venue, hoping to capitalize on the growing wedding and tourism industry that was transforming the region's agricultural economy. It was a compromise that pained him, but seemed necessary for the farm's survival. As his truck rounded the bend, Jack's heart sank. In the distance, the distinctive silhouette of the grand old barn that had dominated the Oakridge skyline for over 175 years appeared dramatically altered. A section of the newly replaced wooden floor had completely collapsed, creating a gaping hole in what was supposed to be his financial salvation. "Damn it all," Jack muttered, bringing the truck to a stop and sitting for a moment in stunned silence. The barn renovation had consumed nearly all of his operating capital, a calculated risk to diversify the farm's income beyond its struggling dairy operation and seasonal maple syrup production. Now that investment lay literally in ruins, another setback in what had been years of challenging transitions for Oakridge Farm. Jack parked near the damaged structure and stepped out into the mud-slicked ground, Scout leaping from the passenger seat to investigate the transformed landscape. The morning light revealed the full extent of the destruction. The floodwaters had apparently undermined a section of the old foundation, causing the newly installed oak flooring to give way and collapse into what appeared to be a previously unknown void beneath the structure. Walking the perimeter of the collapse, Jack calculated the cost of repairs, money he simply didn't have. Oakridge Farm operated on increasingly thin margins, each season a struggle to break even as milk prices fluctuated wildly and expenses steadily rose. His son Noah, away studying archaeology at the University of Vermont, had been urging modernization. For years, investments Jack could neither afford nor fully embrace, his farming methods rooted in traditions passed down from his father and grandfather. Jack approached the gaping hole in the barn floor cautiously, mindful of unstable edges and potential further collapse. Grabbing a flashlight from his truck, he shone it down into the darkness below. What he saw made no sense according to any understanding of the barn's construction. Beneath the expected dirt foundation and stone footings was what appeared to be a passageway. A tunnel with walls of fitted stone disappearing into darkness beneath the undamaged section of the barn. "What on earth?" Jack muttered, calling. Scout back from his excited exploration of the barn's perimeter. Using the flashlight, Jack examined the exposed section more carefully. The passageway's construction was deliberate and sophisticated, not some natural formation or drainage system. The stonework was expertly laid, creating a tunnel approximately 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough for a person to traverse in a crouched position. Jack's confusion deepened as he spotted what appeared to be the remains of an old wooden ladder leading down into the tunnel, now mostly rotted away from age and moisture. His great-great-grandfather's barn apparently contained a secret underground passage, a hidden space whose existence had gone unmentioned in family lore, its purpose unknown to subsequent generations of Mercers who had worked and lived in its shadow for over 150 years. The discovery might have remained a curious footnote in an already difficult day had Jack not noticed something glinting amid the debris at the bottom of the hole. Carefully positioning himself at the edge, he used a rake from the barn wall to gently pull the object closer. It was a small metal container, its surface tarnished with age but still intact. Retrieving it from the rubble, Jack brushed away decades of dirt to reveal an intricately designed metal box, its surface engraved with symbols that included a 5-pointed star and what appeared to be a simplified flame or candle. Before Jack could examine the box further, his phone rang. The screen showed Noah calling for their regular weekend check-in, unaware of the barn's collapse. "Dad, how are things? Classes are getting intense as we wrap up the semester." Jack hesitated, looking between the damaged barn and the mysterious box in his hand. "The barn floor collapsed, Noah. The flooding must have undermined the foundation. Insurance cover it?" "Doubtful. The policy has that ridiculous flood exclusion, remember? But there's something strange. The collapse revealed some kind of stone tunnel underneath the barn. I've never seen anything like it, and I found this metal box with strange markings." Noah's voice sharpened with interest. "A tunnel? What kind of tunnel, and what does the box look like?" "I mean, your great-great-great-grandfather apparently built a secret passage underneath the barn, and nobody in the family ever mentioned it. The box has a star and something like a candle or flame carved into it." There was a momentary silence on the line. "Dad, take pictures of everything before you move anything else. This could be historically significant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A tunnel from the 1840s with those markings. That's the peak of the Underground Railroad in Vermont." Jack snorted softly. "Important to who?" "It's probably just some old storage cellar Elijah didn't bother telling anyone about." Man was known for his odd construction methods. "Dad, please document everything. Don't try to go into the tunnel alone. Those old structures can be dangerously unstable. I'll try to come home tomorrow with Professor Thornton. She specializes in pre-Civil War history and would know what to look for." After promising his son he'd be careful, Jack ended the call and turned back to the collapsed section with a more methodical eye. Following Noah's advice, he began taking photos with his phone, documenting the structure of the hidden passageway and the position of the debris. As he worked, he noticed more objects partially buried in the rubble, what looked like old metal lantern parts, fragments of pottery, and most intriguingly, several iron spikes that didn't match any traditional barn construction methods he knew. The discovery troubled Jack in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His great-great-grandfather Elijah had been a successful farmer, but also something of a local enigma. Educated beyond most of his peers, maintaining correspondence with people from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, occasionally disappearing. On trips he would never explain upon his return. Family stories painted him as brilliant but secretive, progressive in his thinking but intensely private about certain activities. Later that morning, as Jack carefully extracted items from the more accessible portions of the tunnel entrance, a gleaming black SUV pulled up the farm's driveway. Richard Caldwell, whose luxury resort development company had been steadily purchasing struggling family farms throughout the county, stepped out in designer boots that seemed determined to remain pristine despite the muddy surroundings. His repeated offers to buy Oakridge Farm, particularly its scenic river frontage and maple groves, had become a source of tension between them. "Heard about the flooding damage on the community board," Caldwell called out, approaching with an expression of practiced concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. He spotted the collapsed floor and whistled low. "Bad business, Jack. That event venue conversion was a solid plan." Jack straightened instinctively, moving to block Caldwell's view of the tunnel entrance and the items he'd been recovering. "Nothing that can't be handled," he replied, his tone making it clear that assistance was neither expected nor required. Caldwell's gaze moved past Jack to the collapsed section, his expression changing as he noticed the stone passage now visible. Beneath the barn floor. "What's that underneath? Doesn't look like any barn foundation I've ever seen." "Just some old storage area, I expect," Jack replied, keeping his voice casual despite a sudden protective instinct regarding his discovery. Caldwell studied the exposed tunnel with new interest. "Storage area? That looks like something else entirely. Almost resembles historical structures I've seen at museum sites." His attention shifted to Jack's mud-splattered hands and the cleaning cloth he'd been using to gently wipe decades of dirt from the metal box. "Found anything interesting in there?" Jack deflected the question, suddenly conscious of Noah's insistence on the potential historical significance of the discovery. "Just old farm implements, nothing valuable. I appreciate the concern, but I've got this under control." Caldwell lingered, his eyes repeatedly drawn to the tunnel entrance. "You know, Jack, my offer for the property still stands, flood damage and all. In fact, historical features like this could actually enhance the property's value for our heritage tourism concept. We could integrate it into our development plans, give it proper preservation. The suggestion that Oakridge Farm might become another sterile heritage experience in Caldwell's growing portfolio of luxury developments made Jack's jaw tighten. "I'll keep that in mind," he responded, his tone suggesting precisely the opposite. After Caldwell finally departed, promising to send information about historical property tax incentives that might help with the barn situation, Jack returned to his careful examination of the metal box. The lid was sealed with what appeared to be wax that had hardened to stone-like consistency over the decades. Reluctant to damage what might be historically significant, he set it aside for Noah and his professor to examine. Instead, Jack turned his attention to safely accessing more of the tunnel without risking further collapse of the barn floor. Using lumber meant for the renovation, he constructed a temporary brace and secured a sturdy ladder into the opening. With Scout watching anxiously from the edge, Jack descended carefully into the passage, his flashlight illuminating a tunnel that extended beneath the length of the barn toward the river that bordered Oakridge Farm's eastern boundary. The craftsmanship of the tunnel was remarkable, built with precision using local fieldstone and mortar that had withstood more than a century and a half of Vermont's punishing freeze-thaw cycles. The floor was packed earth covered with what appeared to be rotted straw or rushes, and at regular intervals, small niches had been carved into the walls, sized perfectly to hold lanterns or candles. About 20 feet into the tunnel, Jack discovered the first definitive evidence of its purpose, A small alcove had been built into the side wall, just large enough for a person to sit or perhaps sleep if necessary. Inside the alcove lay the deteriorated remains of what might have been a blanket and a leather pouch containing several coins with dates from the 1830s. Jack's historical knowledge was limited to what he'd learned in school and from local town celebrations, but even he recognized the implications of these findings. This was almost certainly part of the Underground Railroad, the secret network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in Canada before the Civil War. Elijah Mercer, it seemed, had been a conductor on this dangerous and illegal operation, risking imprisonment or worse to help fellow human beings reach freedom. As the realization dawned on Jack, so did a deeper understanding of his family's legacy. The Mercer farm wasn't just a struggling agricultural operation facing modern economic challenges. It was a place where his ancestors had taken extraordinary risks to uphold their moral convictions in defiance of unjust laws. The secretive behavior, the unexplained trips, the correspondence with distant contacts all suddenly made sense in this new context. Jack continued carefully along the tunnel until he reached what appeared to be its end, a stone wall with no obvious exit. Examining it more closely, he noticed that several stones seemed to be fitted differently than the others. Applying gentle pressure, he found that they moved slightly, suggesting a concealed door or exit that had been designed to be invisible from the outside. The tunnel likely emerged somewhere near the riverbank, providing a route to move people quickly to boats if necessary. Returning to the barn, Jack emerged from the tunnel with a profound sense of connection to Elijah and the moral courage he must have possessed. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Noah, who had apparently been trying to reach him with more information after consulting with his professor. "Dad, where were you? I've been calling for an hour." Noah's voice carried equal parts concern and excitement. "Sorry, I was exploring the tunnel. It's definitely what you suspected. There's evidence people were hidden there. Sleeping alcoves, places for lanterns, even an old pouch with coins. Professor Thornton is certain, based on my description, that it's an underground railroad station. She's bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment tomorrow to help map the tunnel system without causing further damage. And Dad, that box you described with the star and flame, that's a known conductor's marker. It might contain documentation or conductor journals, which are incredibly rare. Most conductors destroyed all evidence to protect the network and the people they helped." Jack described his findings in detail, including the concealed exit he believed led to the river. Noah explained that Riverdale had been known to have underground railroad activity, but very few authenticated stations had ever been discovered, making this find potentially significant beyond their family history. The morning after his discovery, Jack awoke before dawn, his mind racing with questions about Elijah and the secret passageway beneath the barn. Sleep had come fitfully, interrupted by dreams of people moving silently through the night, guided by the moral conviction of his ancestor. Jack had spent hours after nightfall reading through some of Elijah's old letters that had been preserved in the family's documents, searching for coded references to Underground Railroad activities that he might have missed when reading them previously. The financial realities that had seemed so pressing the previous morning, the barn renovation costs, the upcoming property tax payment, Noah's tuition, now competed with a growing sense of responsibility toward the historical significance of what lay beneath his struggling farm. Oakridge operated on increasingly narrow margins, a condition familiar to most family agricultural operations in an era where corporate farming and luxury developments like Caldwell's were rapidly reshaping Vermont's rural communities. Jack had taken out a second mortgage 3 years earlier after a devastating maple season had coincided with a crash in milk prices, and the terms had grown more burdensome as interest rates climbed. The bank had made it clear that their patience was limited. Restructuring would require collateral he simply didn't have. The irony wasn't lost on Jack that his land, granted to Elijah through early Vermont settlement incentives and maintained through generations of backbreaking work, was worth more to developers than anything the soil could produce. Caldwell and his investors had offered a substantial sum that would clear all debts and leave enough to resettle comfortably. Perhaps in one of those new developments outside Burlington, where former farmers lived in planned communities with quaint red barns preserved as decorative features rather than working buildings. Scout nudged Jack's hand with his nose, reminding him of the day's chores that wouldn't wait for historical revelations to be processed. "I know, boy," Jack sighed, rubbing the dog's ears. "Cows don't milk themselves." He had just pulled on his work boots when his phone rang, the bank's number appearing on the screen. "Mr. Mercer, this is Amanda Parker from First Vermont Agricultural Trust." The loan officer's voice carried the forced pleasantness that Jack had come to associate with financial ultimatums. "I'm calling about your upcoming payment and a matter requiring immediate attention." Jack braced himself. "I'm listening." "We've received notification of significant structural damage to one of the buildings on your property, a barn undergoing renovation, I believe. As you know, any material change to collateralized property requires immediate disclosure to the lien holder." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "How exactly did you learn about damage that happened yesterday?" "That's not relevant, Mr. Mercer. What matters is that our contract requires professional assessment of any structural failures on mortgaged property. I'll be sending our approved inspector out this afternoon." The call ended with Parker's assurance that this was standard procedure. But Jack knew better. Information flowed quickly in small agricultural communities, and Richard Caldwell served on the bank's agricultural advisory board. The sudden interest in the barn couldn't be coincidental. Not after Caldwell had witnessed Jack recovering items from the hidden tunnel. 30 minutes later, Jack was back at the collapsed section, working to secure the area before the bank's inspector arrived. He had decided to cover the tunnel entrance with tarps, claiming safety concerns while obscuring the full nature of what lay beneath. As he worked, he recalled passages from Elijah's journals describing the barn's construction in 1842. His great-great-grandfather had hired specialized stoneworkers from Boston for certain aspects of the foundation, paying premium wages for their discretion. By mid-morning, Jack had secured the area as best he could, but his mind was troubled by the realization that Caldwell would not be easily deterred once he understood the historical significance of the discovery. A vehicle approaching drew Jack's attention rather than the bank inspector's car. He recognized the weathered pickup truck belonging to Walter Simmons, the town's elderly librarian and self-appointed local historian. Walter had been a friend of Jack's father and maintained Riverdale's most comprehensive collection of regional historical materials, both official and unofficial. "Thought I might find you here," Walter called out, carefully navigating the muddy ground with his cane. At 80, Walter moved more slowly than in years past, but his mind remained sharp and his curiosity undiminished. "Word travels fast about that barn floor coming down. Figured you might need someone who remembers the old stories." Jack had always respected Walter's discretion and knowledge. If anyone might shed light on Elijah's activities without broadcasting the discovery to the entire county, it would be the librarian. "You knew about my family's connection to the Underground Railroad?" Jack asked directly. Walter nodded, examining the partially covered tunnel entrance with keen interest. "Not specifically about this station, no, but I had my suspicions about Elijah. My great-grandfather Josiah mentioned the Mercers in his journals, described Elijah as a man of uncommon moral courage, whose barn occasionally housed more than livestock on moonless nights." The old man's eyes narrowed, as he spotted the metal box Jack had recovered. "May I?" Jack handed Walter the box, watching as the older man ran his fingers over the engraved symbols with something approaching reverence. "The flame and star," Walter murmured. "Conductor's markers. These were used to identify safe houses and guides within the network." Elijah wasn't just providing occasional shelter, Jack. This level of infrastructure, a hidden tunnel to the river, suggests he was a significant conductor on the Vermont route to Canada. Walter carefully examined the seal on the box. These weren't opened casually. They often contained information that could endanger the entire network if discovered. Maps of routes, names of other conductors, perhaps financial records of the support network. The fact that it remained sealed suggests it might have been an emergency repository, only to be opened if something happened to Elijah. The explanation aligned with cryptic references in Elijah's journals about responsibilities that transcend law when law transcends moral authority, and providing safe passage through darkness toward light. Jack shared some of the journal entries with Walter, who nodded in recognition at certain phrases. "The North Star collection mentioned here," Walter noted, pointing to a passage Jack had found significant, "likely refers to groups of freedom seekers." The North Star was a powerful symbol in the Underground Railroad. Following it meant traveling north toward freedom. As they discussed the implications of Elijah's secret work, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. The bank's inspector had arrived, accompanied by Richard Caldwell. "Convenient timing," Jack muttered, quickly covering the metal box with his jacket. The inspector, a thin man with a clipboard and the detached efficiency of someone performing a formulaic task, nodded curtly to Jack before beginning his examination of the damaged barn. Caldwell, however, made directly for Jack and Walter, his interest in the covered tunnel entrance undisguised. "Brought Mr. Reynolds up to speed on the way over," Caldwell explained, gesturing toward the inspector. "Structural failure of this magnitude usually indicates deeper problems with the foundation. Whole building might need to be condemned." "The barn has stood for 175 years, Jack counted. One section of flooring collapsed due to exceptional flooding. The structure itself is sound." Caldwell's attention had already shifted to the partially covered opening and the visible stonework of the tunnel entrance. "Now that's a peculiar feature for a barn foundation," he observed, crouching to look more closely. "Almost looks like some kind of underground passage." He turned to Reynolds. "Shouldn't modifications like this have been disclosed when the property was mortgaged? Seems like material information about structural integrity." Reynolds made non-committal notes on his clipboard, but the implied threat was clear: undisclosed. Structural modifications could potentially constitute mortgage fraud, a technicality that might accelerate the bank's claim on the property. Walter Simmons, leaning heavily on his cane, intervened with the quiet authority that had made him respected even among the community's most powerful figures. That feature was included in the original building plans filed with the county in 1842, Mr. Caldwell. He stated with certainty. "I've examined them personally while researching pre-Civil War architecture in the region. Nothing undisclosed about construction that predates current ownership by 5 generations." Whether Walter was telling the truth or running interference, Jack couldn't tell, but the librarian's statement temporarily neutralized Caldwell's implication of impropriety. Reynolds completed his inspection, promised a formal report within 3 business days, and departed with non-specific warnings about potential liability issues should the structure deteriorate further. Caldwell lingered, his interest in the tunnel unabated. "Whatever your great-great-grandfather built down there might be valuable historically, Jack," he suggested with calculated casualness. Historical preservation societies pay significant sums for authenticated underground railroad structures. Might be the solution to your financial troubles. His tone suggested helpful concern, but his eyes remained calculating. "I know people who specialize in private acquisition of historical properties, no complicated grant applications or public access requirements like you'd face with state preservation programs." "I appreciate the thought," Jack replied evenly, "but I'll handle any family historical discoveries my own way." After Caldwell finally departed, Walter turned to Jack with increased urgency. "We need to document everything properly before they find a pretext to seize the property. Your great-great-grandfather didn't risk imprisonment and ruin to have this station commodified as a selling point for luxury condos." Jack nodded, the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. "Noah's professor is coming tomorrow with specialized equipment to document the tunnel without causing further damage. But I can't help wondering what's in this box. It might contain information that would help authenticate the site." Walter examined the sealed container again. These were typically secured with multiple mechanisms, the visible wax seal, but also hidden latches or locks known only to conductors. Your ancestor would have designed it to resist casual intrusion by authorities while remaining accessible to those who knew the proper method. Jack recalled a story his father had told about Elijah's peculiar habit of using astronomical calculations in his farm records, dates of plantings tied to star positions rather than just calendar days. On a hunch, he examined the star symbol more carefully and noticed that the 5 points had small indentations at different positions. Pressing these indentations in sequence from the northernmost point clockwise, he felt a satisfying click as internal mechanisms released. The wax seal, hardened by time, required careful warming before they could safely open the container without damaging its contents. Inside, they found exactly what Walter had suggested might be there: a small leather-bound journal containing coded entries about movement of packages along the northern line, a carefully folded map showing routes from Riverdale to the Canadian border with markings for safe houses and dangerous checkpoints, and most significantly, a list of names with dates. Presumably, people Elijah had helped escape to freedom. "This is extraordinarily rare," Walter whispered, carefully turning the brittle pages with gloved hands Jack had fetched from the milking parlor. "Most conductors destroyed all documentation to protect themselves and others in the network. This repository must have been sealed and hidden when the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 increased penalties and surveillance, making Elijah's activities even more dangerous." The journal contained entries spanning nearly a decade, each cryptically recording movements of individuals or family groups through Oakridge Farm toward Canada. Some entries noted particular hardships, injuries, illness, or pursuit by authorities, while others recorded small details about the people themselves: a woman's beautiful singing voice, a child's quick mind, a man's skill as a carpenter. He saw them as people, not just packages, Jack observed, deeply moved by his ancestors' humanity shining through even his coded language. He recorded things that mattered to them, things that made them individuals. As they carefully documented the contents, Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Noah announcing that he and Professor Thornton would arrive first thing in the morning. Walter agreed to reach out to contacts at the Vermont Historical Society who could be trusted to approach the discovery with appropriate sensitivity and discretion. "Your family has protected this legacy for generations without even knowing it," Walter observed as they secured the materials and restored the protective covering over the tunnel entrance. "Now you have the chance to ensure it's preserved properly, not as a curiosity for tourists, but as testament to ordinary people doing extraordinarily courageous things when morality demanded action against unjust laws." The sun was setting by the time Walter departed, promising to return the following day with additional resource materials about Vermont's role in the Underground Railroad. Jack stood alone by the barn, watching the day's last light illuminate the maple groves that had sustained his family for generations. The financial pressures that had seemed so overwhelming hadn't disappeared. The collapsed barn floor still needed repair, the bank still expected its payments, and the farm still operated on precarious margins. Yet something fundamental had shifted in Jack's understanding of Oakridge Farm and his relationship to it. This land wasn't merely an agricultural operation struggling against economic forces beyond his control. It was a place where his ancestor had made a moral stand at great personal risk, creating a legacy of courage that transcended crop yields and property values. Jack had always seen himself as the potentially failed caretaker of a family farming tradition. Now he recognized a deeper responsibility to honor not just the agricultural heritage of Oakridge, but its history as a place where moral conviction had manifested in dangerous but necessary action. Whatever happened with the bank and Caldwell's development ambitions, that legacy deserved protection as fiercely as Elijah had protected those seeking freedom along his secret passage to liberty. The following morning dawned with unusual clarity for early Vermont spring. The storm clouds of previous days replaced by crystalline blue skies that belied the turmoil in Jack Mercer's life. He had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by visions of Elijah leading frightened strangers through darkened tunnels, always just a few steps ahead of shadowy pursuers. By dawn, Jack had abandoned any pretense of rest and sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by photocopies of Elijah's journals Walter had provided, attempting to decipher the coded language his ancestor had used to document his clandestine activities. The journals revealed far more than just Underground Railroad operations. Elijah Mercer had maintained extensive correspondence with abolitionist leaders across New England, providing financial support to the movement beyond just offering his farm as a station. Investment records showed how he had diverted significant portions of the farm's profits to purchase supplies for other safe houses along the route to Canada, often disguising the expenditures as agricultural necessities in his official records. Most striking were Elijah's philosophical writings, passionate arguments against slavery, couched in religious and moral frameworks that revealed him as not merely a participant in the Underground Railroad, but a principled thinker who had developed complex ethical justifications for defying federal law. When human law stands in opposition to divine law, Elijah had written in one particularly moving passage, a Christian man has no choice but to follow the higher authority regardless of personal consequence. Jack was struggling to reconcile this image of Elijah, radical activist, risking everything for moral principle, with the practical farmer who had established Oakridge as a successful agricultural operation. This wasn't merely a man who had occasionally sheltered fugitives. This was someone who had built elaborate infrastructure, maintained extensive networks, and developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks to justify civil disobedience. The rumble of vehicles on the gravel driveway pulled Jack from his contemplation. Noah had arrived with Professor Eleanor Thornton, a woman in her early 60s whose practical field clothes and sturdy boots suggested someone accustomed to archaeological work rather than just classroom lectures. Noah embraced his father warmly before making introductions. Professor Thornton specializes in pre-Civil War resistance movements, Noah explained. She's been documenting Underground Railroad sites across New England for 20 years. The professor assessed Jack with sharp eyes behind sensible glasses. Your son has shown me the photographs of the tunnel entrance and conducted box. Frankly, I thought he might be exaggerating the significance, but if these images are accurate, you've discovered something truly extraordinary. Jack led them to the barn, where Walter was already waiting with additional historical materials he'd gathered overnight. The elderly librarian had brought county maps from the 1840s, showing property boundaries and waterways that might have connected to the Oakridge tunnel system. "We've temporarily secured the collapsed area," Jack explained, showing them the reinforcements he'd installed. "I didn't want to risk further damage before proper documentation." Professor Thornton nodded approvingly as she examined the tunnel entrance. "Wise decision. Too many historical sites are compromised by well-intentioned but hasty explorations." She unpacked specialized equipment from hard-sided cases, a ground-penetrating radar unit, digital mapping tools, and lighting systems designed specifically for subterranean historical sites. "This technology allows us to map the entire tunnel system without physically entering unstable sections," she explained, assembling the radar unit on a wheeled platform that could be maneuvered around the barn floor. "We can generate three-dimensional images of what lies beneath without causing further structural damage." While Noah and the professor set up their equipment, Jack showed Walter the additional journal entries he'd discovered overnight. The librarian's eyes widened as he examined a page containing what appeared to be financial records. "This is remarkable," Walter murmured. "These aren't just records of Elijah's personal contributions, but suggest systematic financial support from a network of northern industrialists who publicly maintain neutrality on slavery while privately funding underground railroad operations." Jack had noticed the same pattern: coded references to investors with initials that matched prominent New England manufacturing families, regular dividends that aligned with documented movements of freedom seekers through Oakridge. Elijah wasn't working alone. He had powerful silent partners. Many wealthy Northerners held complex positions on abolition, Walter explained, publicly moderate to protect business interests in both North and South, privately contributing to resistance, efforts through networks designed with plausible deniability. "Your great-great-grandfather appears to have been a key node in that financial network, not just a conductor." Their discussion was interrupted by an exclamation from Professor Thornton, who was studying the first radar images appearing on her specialized tablet. "Gentlemen, this is extraordinary. The tunnel doesn't just lead to the river as you suspected, it branches in three directions, with chambers at regular intervals. This isn't just a simple escape route, it's an elaborate system designed to house multiple people for extended periods if necessary." She showed them the emerging three-dimensional model of the underground network. The main tunnel, indeed, led toward the river approximately 200 yards away, but additional passages extended toward what would have been the edge of Elijah's property line in the 1840s, suggesting connections to neighboring farms or natural features that might have provided additional escape routes. "The construction quality is remarkable," the professor continued, her professional composure giving way to genuine excitement. "The stonework shows sophisticated engineering knowledge, with drainage systems and air circulation chambers that would have made extended shelter possible. Your ancestor wasn't just offering temporary passage, he built infrastructure for sustained resistance operations." Noah had been examining the conductor's box and its contents more thoroughly, using his archaeological training to document each item properly. "Dad, there's something else here we missed last night," he said, carefully extracting a folded piece of parchment that had been hidden in a false bottom of the box. "It looks like a manifest of some kind." Unfolded and carefully smoothed, the document revealed columns of names, dates, and destinations, a meticulous record of every person Elijah had helped escape through Oakridge Station over a period of 15 years. Most entries contained only first names or initials, protecting identities should the document be discovered. But the total count was staggering. 126 men, women, and children had passed through the Mercer farm on their journey to freedom. "This is historically invaluable," Professor Thornton whispered, photographing the document with specialized equipment designed for fragile historical materials. Most Underground Railroad conductors destroyed all records to protect themselves and those they helped. A complete manifest like this, especially from a major Vermont station, is unprecedented. The magnitude of Elijah's work was overwhelming. Jack had grown up hearing sanitized school versions of the Underground Railroad, brave conductors occasionally sheltering fugitives on their path north. The reality documented in Elijah's records was far more extensive, a sophisticated operation sustained over decades, processing dozens of freedom seekers annually through an elaborate physical infrastructure designed for maximum security and survivability. The documentation continued through the morning, each discovery revealing new dimensions of Elijah Mercer's secret life. The most poignant findings were small, personal items recovered from alcoves within the accessible portion of the tunnel. A child's wooden doll, carefully wrapped and hidden in a wall cavity, a hand-carved comb with intricate designs suggesting West African origins, a small leather Bible with handwritten notes in its margins, documenting a family's separation and their hopes for reunion in Canada. These personal artifacts humanize the historical record, Professor Thornton explained, carefully cataloging each item. They remind us that the Underground Railroad wasn't just a political resistance movement, but a human story of individual courage, both of those escaping and those helping them. As they worked, Jack noticed Noah's growing emotional connection to their discoveries. His son had always been academically interested in history, but this direct link to their family's past was clearly affecting him on a deeper level. "I never understood why I felt drawn to studying resistance movements," Noah confessed quietly, as they examined a section of tunnel wall where someone had scratched a small North Star symbol. "Now I wonder if some part of me somehow knew, if this moral courage is somehow in our blood." Jack understood the sentiment. He had always seen himself as simply a struggling farmer, the latest in a line of Mercers trying to maintain the family, land against increasing odds. Now he recognized that Elijah's legacy was more complex, not just agricultural knowledge passed through generations, but a moral inheritance that changed how he understood his responsibility to the farm and its history. Their work was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Two official-looking SUVs with state government plates pulled into the farm driveway, followed by Richard Caldwell's luxury vehicle. A woman in her 40s emerged from the lead SUV, approaching with practiced authority and producing credentials identifying her as Diana Harlow, representative of the Vermont Historical Preservation Office. "Mr. Mercer," she began without preamble, "we've received information regarding the discovery of historically significant Underground Railroad artifacts on your property. I'm here to evaluate these materials and ensure their proper preservation, according to state guidelines." Professor Thornton stepped forward, introducing herself with professional courtesy that barely masked suspicion. "I wasn't aware the VHPO conducted unannounced field interventions, Agent Harlow. Typically, your office coordinates with academic institutions already involved in authentication processes." Harlow's expression remained neutral. When materials potentially relating to national historical significance are involved, particularly on private property facing financial distress, we operate under different protocols. She turned back to Jack. "Mr. Mercer, we'll need immediate access to all historical materials recovered from your property." Jack noticed Caldwell standing by his vehicle, watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. The developer had clearly alerted state authorities to the discovery, likely hoping to advance whatever scheme he had developed for Oakridge Farm. "These materials have been in my family's possession for over 175 years, Jack responded evenly. "I'm not surrendering them without proper legal documentation specifying the government's authority to seize private property, particularly historically. Significant artifacts connected to my direct ancestors." Harlow's expression hardened slightly. We're not seizing anything, Mr. Mercer. We're securing historically significant artifacts for proper evaluation and preservation. Underground railroad materials are of critical importance to national heritage and require specialized preservation environments. That's a creative interpretation of historical preservation statutes, Walter interjected, his elderly frame somehow commanding despite his physical frailty. The VHPO has assessment authority but not unilateral confiscation powers for privately held historical materials, particularly those with documented family provenance. The tension was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle. A woman in her 70s emerged from a modest sedan, her bearing dignified despite visible age. Mr. Mercer, my name is Margaret Campbell. I believe you found materials connected to my great-great-grandfather's work with the Freedom Protection Network. The name registered immediately. Several entries in Elijah's journals had mentioned a Campbell connection in Burlington, who provided funds and coordination with Canadian contacts. Jack invited her closer, recognizing another player had entered the increasingly complex situation surrounding Elijah's hidden legacy. News travels remarkably fast for supposedly secret historical discoveries, Jack observed, offering coffee, which Dr. Campbell accepted with a gracious nod. The network may have disbanded officially after emancipation, but descendants of original members maintain certain communications channels, she explained. When state historical preservation units mobilize suddenly in rural Vermont, we notice. Her direct gaze carried the confidence of substantial resources and influence. Diana Harlow appeared momentarily disconcerted by Campbell's arrival, but quickly regained her professional composure. Dr. Campbell, while your family's historical connection is noted, the state has responsibility to ensure proper preservation of significant historical artifacts. Which is precisely why I'm here, Campbell replied smoothly. The Campbell Historical Truth Foundation specializes in preserving Underground Railroad materials within their community contexts, rather than extracting them to centralized repositories where their local significance is diminished. Jack realized he was witnessing a power struggle between competing approaches to historical preservation, state institutional control versus community-based stewardship. Campbell turned to him directly. Mr. Mercer, I represent a private foundation dedicated to maintaining the network's original mission, ensuring historical materials remain accessible to communities where resistance activities actually occurred. Unlike government agencies or developers seeking commodification of your property's historical value, we have no agenda regarding the content of these materials. At what cost? Jack asked directly. My farm faces foreclosure within months. Every party expressing interest in these artifacts has financial resources I can't match, and motivations I can't fully trust. Campbell nodded understanding. The Campbell Historical Truth Foundation offers a straightforward proposition. We provide financial resources to secure your property and establish a proper archival facility here at Oakridge. Under your family's continued stewardship, the collection remains intact, professionally preserved, and accessible to legitimate researchers and community members without political filtering. The proposal was unexpectedly aligned with what Jack himself had been considering ideal, but impossible. Why maintain the collection here rather than in an established museum? Because Elijah Mercer chose this location deliberately, Campbell answered. The network believed geographical decentralization protected against concentrated power, controlling historical narratives. Multiple collections in diverse locations, each maintained by families committed to historical truth rather than institutional interests or commercial exploitation. Richard Caldwell had been observing the exchange with growing impatience. He approached the group, his expensive cologne incongruous in the barn's earthy atmosphere. "Jack, these government complications can drag on for years. My offer stands full. Market value for the property, debt clearance, and appropriate recognition of the historical features in our heritage tourism development." Professor Thornton, who had been quietly documenting the tunnel system throughout this confrontation, looked up sharply. "Heritage tourism development? You mean display panels in the lobby of luxury condominiums where wealthy weekenders can glance at sanitized history between ski runs?" Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you, Professor, our historical consultants maintain the highest standards for interpretive content." "I'm certain they do," she replied, her tone suggesting exactly the opposite, particularly regarding aspects of history that might discomfort potential property buyers. The standoff might have escalated further had Noah not intervened with unexpected diplomatic skill. "Perhaps we can reach a reasonable compromise. Dad's primary concern is preserving both the farm and the historical integrity of Elijah's legacy. If Dr. Campbell's foundation can provide written assurance regarding funding, preservation standards, and research access, maybe we can discuss cooperative assessment procedures that respect state interests without surrendering family stewardship." Professor Thornton nodded approvingly at Noah's approach. "The university would be pleased to participate in a joint preservation protocol that respects both the Mercer family's custodial rights and appropriate state documentation requirements." Diana Harlow recognized the strategic retreat being offered. "That could be arranged. My team can prepare a memorandum of understanding detailing cooperative assessment procedures while respecting current possession during initial evaluation phases." With temporary détente established, arrangements were made for a formal meeting. The following day, involving all parties, Caldwell departed with obvious disappointment at the lack of immediate resolution, while Dr. Campbell remained behind as the others dispersed to prepare documentation. "Your ancestor wasn't merely preserving his own activities," Campbell explained once they were alone. "Elijah Mercer was part of a network that recognized certain historical truths might be deliberately obscured if centralized institutions controlled the narrative. The network members believed future generations deserved unfiltered access to evidence of both moral courage and moral failure during our nation's most divisive period." Jack nodded slowly, understanding Elijah's vision with greater clarity. He wasn't just breaking the law to help individuals reach freedom. He was preserving evidence of a resistance movement that dominant historical narratives might minimize or sanitize. "Precisely," Campbell confirmed. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a humanitarian operation. It was a deliberate challenge to institutional power, legal authority, and economic systems built on human bondage. That complexity doesn't always survive in official historical accounts that prefer simpler narratives of national progress. After Campbell departed, with promises of formal proposals to follow, Jack found himself alone with Noah and Walter in the barn, where 5 generations of Mercers had worked the farm's harvest. The elderly librarian had been unusually quiet during the confrontation with state authorities and Caldwell, but now he fixed Jack with a penetrating gaze. "You understand what you're facing, don't you?" Walter asked softly. "This isn't just about historical artifacts or even saving your farm from foreclosure. It's about who controls the narrative of resistance in American history. Institutional authorities or the actual communities where that resistance occurred." Noah had been examining the 3-dimensional model of the tunnel system Professor Thornton had generated. "It's remarkable how much effort Elijah put into this infrastructure," he observed. "These weren't impulsive acts of conscience, but sustained, deliberate resistance requiring enormous resources and risk over decades. Jack nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. And now we have to decide whether that legacy belongs in government archives, corporate heritage displays, or remains where Elijah intended, connected to the land and community where he actually did the work. Walter rose slowly, gathering his research materials. Your great-great-grandfather didn't risk imprisonment and financial ruin simply to help people escape to freedom, though that alone would have been worthy. He built this infrastructure and preserved these records because he understood that controlling historical memory is itself a form of power. One that future generations would need to challenge institutional narratives that might diminish the moral complexity of our national founding. As Walter departed with promises to return for the next day's negotiations, Jack and Noah remained in the barn, silently contemplating the tunnel entrance that had lain hidden beneath their families' feet for generations. The financial pressure that had driven Jack to convert the historic barn into an event venue now seemed trivial compared to the responsibility of preserving Elijah's true legacy, not just as a successful farmer, but as a moral revolutionary who had chosen dangerous defiance of unjust laws. "What are you thinking, Dad?" Noah asked finally, noting his father's extended silence. "I'm thinking about choices," Jack replied slowly. "Elijah could have been a successful farmer without taking these risks. He chose moral action over personal security. I've spent years focused on just keeping this place financially viable, never questioning whether there might be a deeper purpose to Oakridge beyond agricultural production." Noah gestured toward the open conductor's box with its documents spread carefully on a preservation sheet. Maybe that's exactly what he was protecting, not just people escaping slavery, but the very idea that ordinary citizens have a moral responsibility that sometimes transcends legal authority. That's not a comfortable, historical narrative for institutions built on that same authority. Jack nodded, understanding with greater clarity the competing interests now circling Oakridge Farm. This wasn't merely about historical curiosity or even preservation funding. It was about who would control the meaning derived from Elijah's resistance activities. Government institutions, commercial developers, academic researchers, and the Campbell Foundation all brought different interpretive frameworks to the same historical materials, each supporting different contemporary interests. "We need to be careful about tomorrow's meeting," Jack said finally. "Every party at that table has an agenda extending beyond just preserving these artifacts. They're fighting over who gets to interpret their meaning for future generations." Noah smiled slightly, a surprising expression given the seriousness of their situation. That's exactly what Professor Thornton always emphasizes in her lectures, that historical preservation isn't just about protecting physical artifacts, but about who controls the narratives constructed around them. Jack spent the evening reviewing Dr. Campbell's preliminary proposal, which had arrived via email with remarkable speed. The documents outlined a comprehensive approach to preserving both Oakridge Farm as a working agricultural operation and Elijah's Underground Railroad infrastructure as a historical site. The financial components would resolve the immediate mortgage crisis while establishing an endowment for ongoing preservation, all without surrendering the Mercer family's stewardship of either the land or the historical materials. Most importantly, the proposal explicitly protected community access to the site and its artifacts, ensuring that local schools, historians, and descendants of those Elijah had helped could engage directly with this history rather than experiencing it through institutional filters. The following morning, Jack awoke with unusual clarity about the path forward. The kitchen table, where he had once spread bills and calculated minimal debt service payments, now held historical preservation proposals, architectural renderings, for stabilizing the tunnel system, and educational programming concepts for sharing Elijah's legacy with future generations. As he prepared for the day's negotiations, Jack realized that his understanding of Oakridge Farm had fundamentally transformed. This wasn't merely land to be protected from developers or financial pressures. It was a physical connection to moral courage that deserved protection precisely because it represented resistance to institutional authority when that authority violated fundamental human dignity. The conference had been arranged at the town library's meeting room, neutral territory that Walter had secured for the discussions. Representatives from the State Historical Office arrived first, followed by academic participants from 3 universities, Caldwell and his historical consultants, and finally Dr. Campbell with her foundation's legal team. Jack and Noah took seats at the head of the table, a position that symbolically established their central role in any decisions regarding Elijah's legacy. Diana Harlow opened with a formal presentation on the state's historical preservation protocols, emphasizing institutional resources for conservation and the importance of centralized authentication processes. The academic representatives outlined research agendas and publication plans, while Caldwell's team presented elaborate renderings of how the Oakridge historical features could be integrated into their authentic Vermont heritage experience resort development. Throughout these presentations, Jack remained silent, carefully noting how each approach subtly shifted interpretive emphasis away from the more radical aspects of Elijah's activities. State materials highlighted connections to established historical narratives. Academic proposals emphasized scholarly contexts rather than community meanings, and Caldwell's concept sanitized moral resistance into picturesque tourist experiences. When his turn came to respond, Jack stood slowly, looking around the table at the assembled representatives of institutional power, government, academia, and corporate interests, all presuming to tell him what his ancestors' legacy should mean. My great-great-grandfather, Elijah Mercer, made a deliberate choice to violate federal law because he believed moral authority sometimes transcends legal authority. Jack began, his voice steady. He didn't just shelter people seeking freedom. He built infrastructure for sustained resistance to institutions that prioritized property rights over human dignity. He gestured toward the authenticated documents now carefully preserved in archival sleeves. Elijah didn't preserve these records so they could be stored in climate-controlled government archives, passed by academic specialists, or displayed as curiosities in resort lobbies. He preserved them because he believed future generations would need evidence that ordinary citizens sometimes have a moral obligation to resist institutional power. Turning to Dr. Campbell, whose proposal most closely aligned with his emerging vision, Jack continued, Oakridge Farm will remain a working agricultural operation as my ancestor intended, but it will also serve its other purpose, preserving evidence of moral resistance for future generations to access directly, without institutional filtering. Diana Harlow frowned slightly. Mr. Mercer, while your family connection is certainly significant, proper historical preservation requires institutional protocols and centralized authentication processes. Jack interrupted firmly but respectfully. Agent Harlow, my ancestor didn't trust institutions to preserve the moral complexity of his resistance activities. The historical record suggests he was right to be concerned, given how often Underground Railroad history has been simplified into comfortable narratives that minimize its fundamental challenge to institutional authority. Professor Thornton nodded approval, while Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jack outlined his decision. Oakridge would partner with the Campbell Historical Truth Foundation to establish a community-based preservation program that maintained family stewardship, while ensuring professional conservation standards. The State Historical Office would receive full documentation but not physical possession of artifacts, academic researchers would have structured access for legitimate study, and the site would remain closed to commercial development. Elijah. Mercer didn't build that tunnel to create a future tourist attraction, Jack concluded. He built it because he believed some moral principles transcend both law and profit. Honoring that legacy means preserving not just physical artifacts, but the radical moral vision they represent. That ordinary citizens bear responsibility for resisting injustice, even when that resistance challenges powerful institutions. The negotiations continued for hours, establishing protocols for documentation, preservation funding, and research access. By afternoon, a framework had emerged that protected both the farm's agricultural operations and the historical infrastructure. Beneath it, with the Campbell Foundation providing financial stability that freed Oakridge from both bank pressure and developer interests. As the meeting concluded and the various representatives departed, Walter approached Jack with undisguised satisfaction. "Elijah would be proud," the elderly librarian said quietly. "Not just of your decision to preserve his resistance work, but of your understanding why that work matters, not as historical curiosity, but as moral instruction for future generations." Jack nodded, feeling a connection to his ancestor that transcended the genealogical, a shared understanding that sometimes ordinary people must make extraordinary moral choices when confronted with institutional injustice. Oakridge Farm would continue producing agricultural abundance as it had for generations, but it would also serve its other purpose, preserving evidence that moral courage sometimes requires defying authority rather than accommodating it. The sun was setting as Jack and Noah returned to the farm, where Dr. Campbell waited to finalize arrangements for structural engineers to begin stabilizing the tunnel system. As they stood beside the barn, where generations of Mercers had worked, Jack felt a sense of purpose that had been missing throughout years of struggle against financial pressures and agricultural decline. "We've been asking the wrong question all along," he told Noah as they watched the last light illuminate the maple groves, where Elijah had once hidden people seeking freedom. "We've been wondering how to save the farm when we should have been asking why the farm needed saving, what purpose it serves beyond agricultural production." Noah nodded understanding. Elijah knew. That's why he built this place the way he did, not just as productive farmland, but as infrastructure for moral resistance. We're not just preserving buildings and land, we're preserving evidence that ordinary people sometimes have to defy institutions to uphold deeper moral principles. 3 months after the discovery of the hidden tunnel system beneath his barn, Jack Mercer stood watching as specialized conservation architects carefully reinforced a section of stonework that had begun to deteriorate. The transformation of Oakridge Farm had progressed with remarkable speed once the preservation framework was established. The Campbell Foundation's resources had enabled professional stabilization of the underground infrastructure while respecting its historical integrity, creating a delicate balance between modern safety requirements and authentic preservation. The barn itself had been restored using traditional 19th century techniques, its collapsed floor section replaced with hand-hewn timber that matched Elijah's original construction methods. Rather than converting the structure into a commercial event venue, as Jack had originally planned, it now served dual purposes as both a working agricultural building and the entrance point to what had been officially designated the Oakridge Underground Railroad Heritage Center. "The reinforcement should be complete by tomorrow," explained Sophia Chen, the preservation architect who had specialized in underground railroad sites across New England. "We've managed to stabilize the original stonework without compromising its authentic character. Elijah Mercer was an extraordinary builder. These passages have withstood frost heaves and flooding for almost 2 centuries with minimal structural failure." Jack nodded appreciation, still adjusting to the reverential way experts like Chen spoke of his ancestor. For generations, the Mercers had remembered Elijah primarily as the family's agricultural patriarch, the man who had established Oakridge as a productive dairy farm. Now he was being studied as an engineering innovator, radical abolitionist, and key figure in Vermont's resistance movements. "You've preserved the hidden entrance mechanisms?" Jack asked, referring to the concealed door system at the river, end of the main tunnel that had allowed freedom seekers to exit the property undetected. "Absolutely," Chen confirmed. "The counterweight system your ancestor designed was remarkably sophisticated, similar to devices used in medieval castle defenses, but adapted for this specific purpose. We've restored it to working condition while documenting its engineering principles for the historical record." As they continued their inspection of the preservation work, Jack noticed Noah leading a small group of graduate students through the main tunnel, each carrying specialized documentation equipment. His son had postponed his final semester to serve as the site's historical coordinator, working alongside academic partners to develop a comprehensive understanding of Oakridge Station's role in the broader Underground Railroad network. The past 3 months had transformed Noah as profoundly as they had the farm itself. What had begun as academic interest in historical resistance movements had evolved into passionate commitment to preserving not just physical artifacts, but the moral principles they represented. Jack recognized in his son the same intensity that Elijah's journals had revealed, a determination to ensure that evidence of moral courage in defiance of institutional authority remained accessible to future generations. "Dad," Noah called out, catching sight of Jack near the tunnel entrance. "Professor Thornton found something remarkable in the county records. Elijah wasn't working alone. At least 3 neighboring farms had connected tunnel systems, creating a network that could move people across the entire valley without surface exposure." Jack joined the research group, examining the historical maps Noah was displaying on a specialized tablet designed for fieldwork. The documents showed property boundaries from the 1840s, overlaid with recently discovered tunnel routes, revealing a sophisticated underground infrastructure extending far beyond Oakridge Farm. "We've identified 7 connected properties in total," Professor Thornton explained, her initial professional detachment now replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the project. "All owned by families with Quaker or radical abolitionist connections, each containing infrastructure designed to connect seamlessly with adjacent systems." The implications were significant. Elijah hadn't been an isolated moral actor, but part of a coordinated community resistance effort that had transformed the entire valley into an underground railroad superhighway. The discovery challenged simplistic, historical narratives about individual heroes, revealing instead a network of ordinary farmers who had collectively risked everything to oppose an unjust system. "Most remarkable," Thornton continued, "is how they disguised their collaboration through everyday agricultural cooperation. Shared equipment, harvest assistance, communal barn raisings, activities that gave them legitimate reasons for regular contact that masked their clandestine coordination." Jack found himself re-evaluating Riverdale's agricultural history through this new lens. The cooperative farming practices that had defined the region for generations hadn't been merely economic expedients, but deliberate covers for more subversive collaboration. The seemingly innocuous maple sugar cooperative Elijah had helped establish had apparently served as both legitimate business and covert funding mechanism for resistance activities. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Olivia, Jack's daughter, who had been managing Oakridge's agricultural operations while her father and brother focused on the historical preservation efforts. At 26, Olivia combined her business degree with practical farming experience, bringing contemporary sustainable agriculture approaches to the generations-old operation. The maple sap collection system is fully installed, she reported, consulting her digital production management system. We should be ready for this season's first run by next week, assuming temperatures cooperate. Unlike Noah's historical focus, Olivia had approached Oakridge's transformation from a business sustainability perspective. The Campbell Foundation's financial support had enabled agricultural modernization alongside historical preservation, creating unexpected synergies between the farm's dual identities. The Heritage Seed Program approval came through, she added, showing Jack the certification documents on her tablet. We're officially authorized to cultivate and distribute the heirloom crop varieties documented in Elijah's agricultural journals. Several organic specialty markets have already placed advance orders. This integration of historical preservation and agricultural innovation represented the most surprising aspect of Oakridge's evolution. Elijah's detailed records of crop rotation, soil management, and seed preservation, maintained alongside his Underground Railroad activities, had provided a wealth of agricultural knowledge largely forgotten in the era of industrial farming. Varieties of corn, beans, and squash that Elijah had cultivated specifically for their hardiness in Vermont's challenging climate were now being reintroduced through Oakridge's Heritage Agriculture program. The school group from Burlington arrives Thursday, Olivia continued. Switching to the educational programming calendar she managed alongside farm operations. 27 middle school students for the combined historical tour and sustainable agriculture workshop. Jack nodded approval, still marveling at how seamlessly his children had integrated their distinct talents to transform Oakridge's crisis into unprecedented opportunity. Noah's historical expertise and Olivia's business acumen had combined to create a working model of heritage preservation that supported rather than hindered agricultural production. Their conversation was interrupted by Walter's arrival, the elderly librarian moving more slowly these days, but his eyes still bright with intellectual curiosity. At his side walked a tall black woman in her 60s, whose dignified bearing and observant gaze suggested someone accustomed to evaluating historical sites with a professional eye. "Jack," Walter called out, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Josephine Williams, director of the National Underground Railroad Heritage Trail. She's here to evaluate Oakridge for potential inclusion in the National Registry." Jack welcomed the visitor, noting the careful way she observed not just the obvious historical features, but the integration of preservation and ongoing agricultural activity. Dr. Williams had been instrumental in developing authentication standards for underground railroad sites across the country, bringing academic rigor to a field once dominated by local traditions and unverified claims. "Mr. Mercer," she began after preliminary introductions, "what you and your family have accomplished here is extraordinary. Most historical sites struggle to maintain authentic agricultural context alongside preservation efforts. You've managed to enhance both simultaneously." Her approval carried particular weight, given the rigorous standards she had established for national recognition. Many purported Underground Railroad sites had failed to meet her requirements for documentary evidence and authentic preservation. The combination of physical infrastructure, original documentation, and continued agricultural production makes Oakridge uniquely valuable for understanding how resistance activities were integrated into everyday rural life, she continued. Examining the restored barn entrance, Jack appreciated her emphasis on integration rather than separation. That's been our primary goal, to show that Elijah's moral resistance wasn't separate from his agricultural work, but intertwined with it. The same principles that guided his farming practices informed his Underground Railroad activities. Dr. Williams nodded approval, That's precisely the historical understanding we've been working to establish, that the Underground Railroad wasn't an isolated moral crusade, but part of integrated community life for those involved. Resistance wasn't something they did alongside their normal lives, it was embedded within those lives. As they toured the preservation efforts, Dr. Williams provided valuable context about similar sites across New England, helping Jack understand Oakridge's place within the broader historical landscape. The river access point from Elijah's tunnel system apparently connected to water routes extensively documented in Canadian border records, suggesting Oakridge had been a critical junction between land and water transportation networks. Their conversation was momentarily interrupted by the arrival of several vehicles, the weekly delivery of organic dairy processing equipment that would complete Oakridge's transition to on-site production of specialty cheese and butter. Olivia excused herself to oversee the installation, her focus on agricultural operations continuing alongside the historical preservation activities that had transformed their understanding of the farm. "Your family has achieved something rare in historical preservation," Dr. Williams observed as they watched Noah guiding students through documentation protocols in a section of the tunnel. "You've resisted the temptation to transform this place into a static museum or commercialized attraction. It remains a working farm that acknowledges its historical significance without being defined solely by it." Jack recognized the subtle critique of more conventional approaches to historical sites, where preservation often meant removing spaces from productive use and transforming them into carefully controlled visitor experiences. Elijah was primarily a farmer whose moral convictions led him to resistance activities. Separating those aspects of his life would misrepresent who he was. Walter, who had been listening to their exchange with evident approval, added his perspective. "What makes Oakridge significant isn't just the physical infrastructure or even the documentary evidence. It's the continued connection between moral purpose and agricultural production across generations. Jack isn't just preserving his ancestors' resistance legacy. He's extending it through contemporary agricultural practices that similarly challenge dominant systems." The observation struck Jack as insightful, if somewhat unexpected. He hadn't explicitly connected Oakridge's transition to organic, sustainable agriculture with Elijah's moral resistance to slavery, yet Walter clearly saw philosophical continuity between these choices. Both represented conscious decisions to operate outside mainstream economic systems based on ethical considerations rather than maximum profit. Their tour concluded at the river exit point of the tunnel system, where preservation architects had stabilized the ingenious hidden door mechanism Elijah had designed. The location offered views across the valley to neighboring farms that had once formed the connected network of underground railroad stations. National Registry designation would bring additional resources and formal recognition, Dr. Williams explained as they observed the landscape from this historically significant vantage point. But it would also mean increased visitor traffic and greater public scrutiny. Some sites find the transition challenging to their local character. Jack appreciated her transparency about potential complications. "Our primary commitment is to agricultural production alongside responsible stewardship of this historical legacy. Any designation would need to respect that balance." Dr. Williams nodded understanding. The most successful heritage sites maintain their authentic function rather than becoming stage sets of their former purpose. Oakridge's continued agricultural operations actually enhance its historical significance rather than detracting from it. As they returned to the farm buildings, Richard Caldwell's luxury SUV appeared on the approach road, an increasingly common occurrence as the developer struggled to adjust his plans to accommodate Oakridge's unexpected transformation. Despite his initial disappointment at losing the property for his resort development, Caldwell had proven adaptable, revising his nearby projects to capitalize on the growing heritage tourism interest Oakridge was generating. "Jack!" he called out, approaching with the practiced affability that characterized all his interactions. "The historical walking trail connecting our Highland Ridge development to Oakridge is nearly complete. I've brought the interpretive signage content for your review before installation." Indeed, the evolution of their relationship reflected the broader community's shifting response to Oakridge's rediscovered historical significance. Initial tension had gradually transformed into grudging cooperation as Caldwell recognized that authentic preservation could provide marketing value for his adjacent developments without requiring direct control of historically significant properties. Our buyers specifically mention Oakridge's historical significance as a factor in their purchase decisions, Caldwell admitted as Jack reviewed the proposed signage content. They appreciate the connection to genuine local history, even if they're primarily motivated by recreational amenities. Jack noted Caldwell's careful avoidance of any mention of the moral implications of Elijah's resistance activities. The developer's interpretive materials emphasized architectural uniqueness and historical curiosity, while minimizing more challenging aspects of the Underground Railroad's fundamental challenge to legal authority and economic systems. "The focus needs adjustment," Jack said finally, returning the materials with specific annotations. Elijah and his neighbors weren't engaged in these activities because they were architecturally innovative or historically interesting. They were responding to fundamental moral imperatives that directly challenged federal law and economic systems that benefited northern states as well as southern. Caldwell's momentary discomfort revealed the core tension in commercializing moral resistance history. "Of course, those elements can be acknowledged. I'm simply concerned about maintaining an appropriate tone for family visitors who might find it uncomfortable to confront the moral compromises embedded in our national founding," Dr. Williams interjected, her academic credentials clearly intimidating the developer. Perhaps that discomfort is precisely what makes sites like this educationally valuable. The exchange highlighted the ongoing negotiation between historical authenticity and commercial palatability that had characterized Oakridge's transformation from the beginning. Jack had consistently prioritized honest representation of Elijah's moral purpose over more marketable sanitization, even when that choice complicated potential tourism development. After Caldwell departed with promises to revise the interpretive materials, Dr. Williams turned to Jack with newfound respect. "Your commitment to historical integrity over commercial expedience is unfortunately rare in heritage tourism development. Most sites eventually compromise authentic representation for visitor comfort." Jack shrugged slightly. Elijah didn't build that tunnel to create a comfortable historical narrative. He built it because he believed some principles transcend both law and profit. Sanitizing that message would betray his purpose more fundamentally than physical deterioration ever could. As the day's various visitors departed, Jack found himself alone with Walter and his children in the kitchen of the farmhouse that had sheltered 5 generations of Mercers. The evening ritual of shared meals had taken on new significance since the discovery of Elijah's secret legacy, becoming an opportunity to integrate their various activities into a coherent vision for Oakridge's future. The Heritage Seed Program has 12 participating farms confirmed for next season, Olivia reported, consulting her production management system. "We'll be distributing Elijah's corn and bean varieties across 3 counties, with participating farms agreeing to maintain seed purity for future expansion." Noah shared updates on the historical documentation project, where University of Vermont students were creating comprehensive digital records of every artifact recovered from the tunnel system. We've identified 3 freedom seekers documented in Elijah's records who have living descendants interested in visiting Oakridge. They're bringing family documents that might help us understand how their ancestors experienced this station. The conversation reflected the integrated approach that had come to define Oakridge's transformation: agricultural innovation and historical preservation advancing together rather than competing for resources or attention. Jack listened with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that his children had intuitively understood what had taken him longer to grasp. That Elijah's legacy couldn't be divided into separate agricultural and moral compartments without losing essential meaning. Walter, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout dinner, finally spoke with the deliberate care of someone who had been carefully considering his words. "You know, when I first heard about the tunnel discovery, I worried it might become just another historical curiosity, sanitized, commercialized, and separated from its moral purpose. What your family has accomplished here is far more significant." He gestured toward the windows where the barn was visible in the evening light, its restored structure housing both working agricultural equipment and the entrance to Elijah's tunnel system. "You've preserved not just physical artifacts, but the integrated moral vision they represent, that ordinary agricultural communities can embody resistance to injustice through their daily work." The observation crystallized something Jack had been feeling but struggling to articulate: that Oakridge's significance extended beyond either historical preservation or agricultural production to encompass a unified moral purpose that connected past and present. Elijah hadn't compartmentalized his identity as farmer and abolitionist. Those aspects of his life had flowed from the same ethical foundation. The most powerful way to honor Elijah isn't just preserving his tunnel or his journals, Noah added, but continuing the moral purpose that informed both his farming practices and his resistance activities, the commitment to living according to principle even when those principles challenge dominant systems. Olivia, typically more focused on practical business operations than philosophical reflection, surprised Jack with her perspective. That's why the Heritage Seed Program matters beyond just agricultural diversity or market differentiation. It's reclaiming agricultural practices that embodied independence from systems Elijah found morally compromised. Their conversation continued late into the evening, exploring connections between Elijah's 19th century moral resistance and contemporary agricultural choices that similarly challenged industrial food systems. Jack recognized that his children had intuitively integrated aspects of their ancestors' legacy that he had initially seen as separate historical curiosities, understanding that sustainable agriculture and moral resistance could represent complementary expressions of the same ethical framework. Later that night, after Noah and Olivia had retired to their respective spaces, Jack sat alone on the farmhouse porch that overlooked the valley where generations of Mercers had worked the land. The nearly full moon illuminated the landscape, where Elijah had once guided freedom seekers toward the river route, risking his farm, family, and freedom for moral principles that transcended legal authority. Jack reflected on the transformation of the past 3 months, not just of the physical farm, but of his understanding of what Oakridge represented across generations. He had begun this journey focused narrowly on financial survival, viewing the farm primarily as an agricultural operation struggling against economic pressures. Elijah's hidden legacy had revealed a more complex inheritance, not just land and buildings, but moral purpose that connected agricultural stewardship with principled resistance to injustice. The wind carried distant sounds of the river, where Elijah's tunnel had emerged, the water route that had carried so many toward freedom in Canada. Jack imagined his ancestor standing in this same spot, watching for signals from neighboring farms that indicated safe passage or potential danger. The moral clarity required for such work seemed both inspiring and challenging, the willingness to risk everything for principles that transcended immediate self-interest. Morning brought renewed activity as preparations continued for both the maple sugaring season and the arrival of the first official school group to visit the newly designated heritage site. Jack found Noah in the documentation center established in what had once been an underutilized storage building, carefully preparing materials for the educational presentation. "I've been thinking about how to present Elijah's story without either sanitizing its moral challenges or reducing him to simplistic heroism," Noah explained, showing Jack the carefully designed educational materials they had developed with Professor Thornton's guidance. The approach they had chosen emphasized the integrated nature of resistance within everyday agricultural life. How Elijah and his neighbors had embedded moral action within seemingly ordinary farming practices. Rather than presenting the Underground Railroad as a separate historical curiosity, the materials showed how it had grown organically from community connections and shared ethical frameworks that challenged institutional injustice. "We want students to understand that moral resistance wasn't something exceptional people did outside their normal lives," Noah continued. "It was ordinary people integrating ethical principles into their daily work, often at extraordinary risk." Jack nodded approval, recognizing the careful balance between acknowledging Elijah's courage and avoiding the kind of heroic exceptionalism that might distance contemporary students from their own moral responsibilities. The educational approach emphasized that Elijah had been primarily a farmer, whose agricultural success enabled his resistance activities, not a specialized freedom fighter who happened to own agricultural land. "Dr. Williams confirmed our National Registry application is moving forward," Noah added, showing Jack the preliminary documentation. She was particularly impressed by our integration of agricultural production and historical preservation, said, "It represents exactly the approach they're trying to encourage for living historical sites." The national designation would bring additional resources for preservation while establishing Oakridge as a model for other historical sites seeking to maintain authentic working contexts rather than becoming static museums. Jack appreciated the validation, but remained primarily focused on the farm's integrated purpose rather than external recognition. Outside, Olivia was directing the final installation of updated maple sap collection infrastructure, a system that combined traditional methods documented in Elijah's agricultural journals with contemporary efficiency improvements. The heritage approach had already attracted premium contracts with specialty food producers seeking authentic production methods alongside modern quality standards. "The organic certification inspector arrives tomorrow," she informed Jack as he joined her beside the sugar house. "We've met all requirements, and the heritage cultivation methods actually exceed their sustainability standards in several categories. Indeed, the certification would position Oakridge products in premium market segments where ethical production methods commanded price premiums that offset lower industrial-scale volume." Like Noah's historical documentation work, Olivia's agricultural innovations had found unexpected support in Elijah's journals. Agricultural practices developed during the moral crisis of slavery, proving remarkably relevant to contemporary challenges of environmental sustainability and industrial food system alternatives. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Campbell, whose foundation had provided crucial financial support during Oakridge's transformation. At 74, Margaret Campbell remained vigorously engaged in historical preservation. Efforts across New England, bringing both resources and philosophical clarity to projects like Oakridge that emphasize community-based stewardship over institutional control. The integrated agricultural and historical programming you've developed here exceeds even our optimistic projections, she observed, reviewing the educational materials Noah had prepared for the upcoming school visit. Most preservation sites struggle to maintain authentic working contexts alongside historical interpretation. Jack had come to deeply respect Campbell's perspective on historical preservation. Her insistence that moral resistance legacies belong primarily within the communities where that resistance occurred, rather than extracted to centralized institutional archives. The Foundation's approach had protected Oakridge from both government appropriation and commercial exploitation while providing resources necessary for responsible preservation. The educational programming applications have exceeded capacity for the coming season, Campbell continued, showing Jack the registration data. We're currently establishing selection criteria that prioritize schools with limited access to historical resources. This approach aligned with Jack's vision for Oakridge's educational mission, ensuring the site served diverse communities rather than becoming an exclusive resource for privileged schools that could afford premium educational experiences. The Foundation had established scholarship funds that covered transportation costs for rural and urban schools with limited resources, ensuring Elijah's legacy remained accessible across socioeconomic boundaries. As they toured the farm's integrated operations, Campbell observed the preparations for maple sugaring season alongside historical preservation activities. Your great-great-grandfather would recognize this integration of purpose, she noted. His journals reveal someone who never separated agricultural stewardship from moral responsibility, who saw them as complementary expressions of the same ethical framework. Jack nodded agreement, having reached similar conclusions through months of studying Elijah's writings and actions. The more we learn about his agricultural innovations, the more clearly we see their connection to his resistance activities. He was developing farming practices that enhanced self-sufficiency and community resilience, specifically to support moral independence from compromised economic systems. Campbell's expression suggested appreciation for this interpretation. Exactly. The Underground Railroad wasn't just humanitarian resistance to slavery. It was a fundamental challenge to institutional authority that claimed moral legitimacy despite fundamental injustice. Elijah and others like him were creating parallel systems of both practical survival and moral authority. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of the first school buses carrying students from Burlington for the inaugural educational program. Jack watched as Noah and Olivia moved smoothly into their respective roles, Noah leading historical interpretation, while Olivia guided agricultural education components. Despite their different professional interests, his children had developed a seamlessly integrated approach that honored both aspects of Oakridge's legacy. As students filed from the buses, their expressions ranging from excitement to teenage indifference, Jack felt a powerful sense of purpose that transcended his previous concerns about the farm's financial survival. Oakridge had found its contemporary meaning not by abandoning agricultural heritage for historical tourism, but by integrating both aspects into a unified moral vision that connected past and present. Elijah Mercer had risked everything to create infrastructure for moral resistance within ordinary agricultural life. His descendant had now ensured that legacy would remain embedded in working farmland rather than extracted to institutional archives or sanitized for commercial consumption, preserving not just physical artifacts, but the integrated moral purpose they represented. As Jack watched students entering the barn, where Elijah had once hidden freedom seekers beneath ordinary agricultural activities, He recognized that Oakridge Farm had always served dual purposes, producing agricultural abundance while embodying resistance to injustice. The collapsed barn floor had revealed not just a hidden tunnel, but a moral inheritance that connected agricultural stewardship with courageous defiance of institutional authority when that authority violated human dignity. The farm would continue producing maple syrup, dairy products, and heritage crops, as it had for generations, but it would also serve its other purpose, preserving evidence that ordinary citizens sometimes bear extraordinary moral responsibility when principles of human dignity require resistance to unjust laws and economic systems built on exploitation. In saving the farm, Jack had discovered something far more valuable than land or buildings. He had uncovered a family purpose that gave contemporary meaning to Oakridge's past, present, and future. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning, when Jack Mercer's barn floor collapsed, revealing the hidden tunnel beneath. Standing in the restored barn that now served as both working agricultural building and heritage center entrance, Jack watched autumn sunlight stream through windows that had witnessed generations of his family's history. The maple trees beyond blazed with Vermont's famous fall colors, drawing visitors from across the country to experience both the stunning foliage and the remarkable underground railroad site that had transformed Oakridge Farm's identity. Noah approached, clipboard in hand, having just finished guiding a university group through the preserved tunnel system. His son's archaeological training had proven invaluable throughout the preservation process, ensuring that Elijah's engineering marvel remained intact while becoming accessible to researchers and visitors. The Hamilton College professor wants to bring students back in spring, Noah mentioned. They're developing a course specifically around Oakridge's integration of agricultural innovation and moral resistance. This fusion had become Oakridge's defining characteristic, not separating historical preservation from working agriculture, but showing how they had always reinforced each other in Elijah's vision. The Heritage Seed program Olivia managed had expanded to 12 participating farms across 3 counties, reintroducing drought-resistant crop varieties that Elijah had developed specifically to support both agricultural sustainability and resistance activities. What began as historical curiosity had evolved into practical innovation addressing contemporary challenges. Walter Simmons, now confined to a wheelchair but intellectually sharp as ever, sat near the central exhibition where Elijah's conductor box and journals were displayed in specialized preservation cases. The elderly librarian had become Oakridge's historian emeritus, providing context that connected their specific story to broader patterns of community resistance. These weren't isolated heroes, Walter often reminded visitors. These were ordinary farmers who embedded extraordinary moral purpose within everyday community relationships. The afternoon's golden light illuminated the heritage corridor that now connected Oakridge with 6 other authenticated underground railroad sites throughout the valley. The national designation that Dr. Williams had secured provided both recognition and protection, acknowledging the interconnected nature of resistance networks while establishing preservation standards that restricted incompatible development throughout the historically significant landscape. Richard Caldwell, once determined to acquire Oakridge for luxury resort development, had undergone his own transformation. The discovery that his grandfather had participated in the same underground railroad network had profoundly affected his approach to regional development. His companies now specialized in historically sensitive projects that respected community heritage rather than exploiting it as marketable backdrop for disconnected luxury experiences. Jack watched as Olivia led agricultural students through demonstration fields where Elijah's heritage varieties grew alongside modern organic crops. His daughter had seamlessly integrated historical farming methods with contemporary sustainable practices, creating educational programs that showed how traditional knowledge remained relevant to current environmental challenges. 3. Neighboring. Farms had converted to these methods after seeing superior drought resistance during recent difficult growing seasons. Dr. Campbell approached, her foundation support having been instrumental in Oakridge's transformation. "You've created something remarkable here," she observed. "Most historical sites become frozen moments separated from contemporary life. Oakridge remains living connection between past and present, showing how moral purpose can be embedded within ordinary work across generations." As evening approached and visitors departed along the heritage trail, Jack found himself alone in the maple grove, where Elijah had once developed syrup production methods that provided both economic sustainability and cover for resistance activities. The integration still struck him as profound. His ancestor hadn't separated agricultural innovation from moral resistance, but had developed farming practices specifically designed to support both purposes simultaneously. Jack realized that the collapsed barn floor had revealed more than hidden tunnels. It had uncovered his family's true legacy. Oakridge Farm wasn't merely agricultural property to be preserved against economic pressures. It was living testimony that ordinary farmers could embed extraordinary moral purpose within everyday work and community relationships. What began as disaster had revealed his family's deepest purpose, stewarding not just soil and crops, but principles of dignity and justice that remained as vital as when Elijah first carved passage toward freedom beneath ordinary farm buildings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't. Want to pass these up? Just click and check them out.